He lives in his tower of lies and narcissism, and I can no longer remain silent. This man is a threat to everything we have spent decades building as a nation. Meryl Streep's voice rang with anger, her eyes blazing with determination. And if I have to stand alone against an army of his followers, I will, because silence is complicity. The reporter leaned forward. Do you realize that you just publicly called the current president of the United States a sociopath and a narcissist? That could have serious consequences for your career. Meryl pressed her lips into a thin line, her gaze turning cold as steel. So be it. Some things are more important than Hollywood and the Oscars. My country's more important. At that moment, the journalist's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and turned pale. This is from the White House. President Trump wants to go live right now. He wants to answer you personally. The most shocking part is still ahead. Stay tuned to find out how this story ends. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The CNN studio in downtown New York was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. An hour earlier, there had been a routine interview with legendary actress Meryl Streep about her new charity to help immigrant children. No one expected it to escalate into a political firestorm that would engulf the entire country in a matter of minutes. Anderson Cooper, the host, tried to remain unflappable, though the white knuckles of his prepared questions gave him away. Across from him sat Meryl Streep, looking elegant and composed, but with a look of determination on her face that he had never seen in even her most dramatic roles. We're on the air in 30 seconds, the director said, and then began a countdown. 10, 9, 8. Meryl took a deep breath. What she was about to do could ruin her 50-year career. It could destroy all the bridges she had built in the industry. But she couldn't keep quiet any longer. 3, 2, 1, we're on the air. Good evening, America. Anderson Cooper with you, and in our studio today is a living legend of American cinema. Winner of 3 Oscars, a person considered by many to be the greatest actress of her generation, Meryl Streep. The camera zoomed in on Meryl's face. It was calm, but there was something like righteous anger in her eyes. Meryl, first of all, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Your new foundation, Kids Without Borders, has already raised over $15 million for immigrant children. Can you tell us about what inspired you to create this initiative? Meryl sat up straight in her chair. Anderson, I came here today to talk about more than just the foundation. I came here to talk about the future of our country. Cooper frowned slightly. This was not part of the planned interview. For 45 years, I stayed away from politics. For 45 years, I believed that my job as an actress was to create stories that bring people together, not divide them. But today, I can no longer remain silent. Silence fell over the studio. Even the cameramen, usually unperturbed, froze, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Donald Trump is not just a bad president, he is an existential threat to the democracy we have spent more than 2 centuries building. He is so blatantly dishonest, so pathologically narcissistic, that he sees nothing and no one beyond his own ego. Anderson Cooper sat with his mouth open. The producers in the control room began to panic, but no one dared interrupt the live broadcast. I don't use these words lightly, Anderson. I don't call him a sociopath and a malignant narcissist for the sake of it. That's the diagnosis that many mental health professionals have given him, even though they can't say it publicly because of the so-called Goldwater rule. Meryl, Cooper tried to intervene, but the actress raised her hand, stopping him. No, let me finish. We allowed this man to dismantle the institutions of our democracy brick by brick. We allowed him to turn the Oval Office into a branch of his commercial empire. We allowed him to divide us into us and them, and all the while too many of us remained silent, including me. Her voice wavered, but there was no weakness in it, only sorrow and determination. I was silent because I was afraid. I was afraid of persecution. I was afraid of threats from his fanatical followers. I was afraid for my family. But today I realize that there are things more terrible than personal threats. The most terrible thing is to lose the country we love. At that moment, Anderson Cooper's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and turned pale. This is the White House, he whispered, switching off the microphone. The president is requesting a live broadcast. He wants to answer you personally. Meryl's eyes widened, but there was no fear in them, only a determination to see this through. She nodded and Anderson signaled for the director to make contact with the White House. A few seconds later, President Trump's red, angry face appeared on the studio's giant screen. Chapter 2. Face to Face. Ms. Streep, the president began without greeting, his voice tight but controlled. I must say that your comments yesterday were highly inappropriate. I have always said that certain quarters in Hollywood are biased against this administration and the values that millions of Americans share. The CNN studio was dead silent. Technicians and cameramen stood frozen, stunned by what was happening. The president's unscripted live response to a celebrity critic was unprecedented in the history of American television. Meryl Streep sat up slightly in her chair, squared her shoulders, and looked straight into the camera, beaming her image into the White House. Her posture exuded a calm dignity that contrasted with the president's obvious agitation. Mr. President, she began in a level voice, I did not say that I hate America. On the contrary, it is precisely because I love my country with all my heart that I can no longer remain silent as I watch its fundamental values erode. Trump snorted, his nostrils flaring. Fundamental values? You Hollywood elites have no idea what real American values are. You live in your mansions behind high fences and read speeches written by liberal hacks, and then wonder why millions of real Americans support me and not you. Meryl remained calm, but there was a sparkle in her eyes. I grew up in a working-class family in New Jersey, Mr. President. My father worked in a factory until he retired. I know what real work is and real American values. And those values, honesty, compassion, respect for the law, are the ones you trample on every day. The president's face turned crimson. An off-camera aide tried to whisper something in his ear, but Trump brushed him aside like a pesky fly. Nobody watches your movies anymore, Meryl. You're yesterday's news. A pathetic, fading star clinging to his last crumbs of fame while attacking the most successful president in American history. There were gasps from several staff members in the studio. Anderson Cooper's intense gaze shifted from Meryl to the screen with the president, unsure whether to intervene. Meryl smiled, not sarcastically, but with some strange regret. You know, Mr. President, your inability to respond to criticism on the merits without resorting to personal attacks is precisely what I have said about you today. A true leader is not one who surrounds himself with flatterers and attacks his critics. A true leader is one who admits his mistakes and works on them. Trump opened his mouth, but Meryl continued, not letting him get a word in. I know what you're going to say, that I'm a failed actress, that my movies are trash, that I suffer from Trump syndrome. But let's talk about the facts for a minute, about how you've divided our country, about how you've supported its worst, about how your admiration for authoritarian leaders is destroying our international alliances. The president interrupted her, his voice rising almost to a shout. Lies! Everything you say is a lie. America has never been as strong as it was under me. The economy was booming before you took over, and you know it, Meryl countered calmly. But this isn't about the economy. This is about the soul of our nation, what we allow ourselves to say and do, what we consider acceptable. At that moment, the White House feed suddenly cut off, and the screen went black. The studio was momentarily silent, then erupted in nervous conversation. What happened? Did we lose contact? Is this a technical glitch or... Anderson Cooper looked questioningly at the technicians. The connection is broken on their end, one of them replied. They've disconnected. Meryl took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping slightly as if a heavy weight had been lifted from them. I think the president decided he didn't want to continue this conversation, she said with a sad smile. Anderson turned to her, still stunned by what had happened. Meryl, do you realize that something unprecedented has just happened? The sitting president of the United States has entered into a direct public confrontation with you, a citizen, albeit a famous one. I understand the gravity of this moment, Anderson, but I also understand that I could no longer remain silent. For too long, too many of us have chosen comfort over truth. Before Cooper could ask another question, his producer raised his hand and quickly walked towards him, whispering something in his ear. Ladies and gentlemen, Anderson said to the camera, I've just been informed that President Trump has announced an emergency address to the nation in 30 minutes. No reason was given, but given the context, we will, of course, continue to cover this. Meryl, will you remain with us for comment? She nodded. Of course, I started this conversation, and I need to see it through to the end. Chapter 3. The Fire Spreads. The 30 minutes between the interrupted call and the president's address turned into the most tense half-hour of Anderson Cooper's career. The phones in the studio were ringing off the hook. Twitter exploded with the hashtags Yoxer Stripes Vavis Trump And why to who if not Meryl? Representatives from both parties began issuing statements picking sides in this unexpected standoff. Meryl sat in a separate lounge talking on the phone with her husband. Don, I know you're worried. I'm worried too. But I couldn't stay silent any longer. Yes, I understand there will be consequences. No, I don't regret anything I said. She looked tired, but there was the same determination in her eyes. The assistant brought her a cup of tea, which she accepted with a grateful smile. In the main studio, Anderson Cooper led a discussion with experts, trying to make sense of the unprecedented event. Professor Schultz, as a presidential historian, can you think of any similar instance in American history where a sitting president has engaged in direct public confrontation with a critic? The gray-haired man with glasses shook his head. Not at all, Anderson. Yes, we've had presidents who have responded sharply to criticism. Think Truman or Lyndon Johnson. But going on live television to argue with a celebrity, it's unprecedented and, I must say, deeply troubling from an institutional perspective. What about the substance of Meryl Streep's claims? Political scientist Sarah Ramirez. How valid are her accusations? The dark-haired middle-aged woman frowned. Many experts share Streep's concerns about the erosion of democratic norms under this administration. International democracy indices do show the U.S. has been declining in recent years. So factually, she's not too far off the mark. The question is, should celebrities be interfering in political discourse in this way? The discussion continued, opinions were divided, but everyone agreed on one thing. The country is on the threshold of something new and unpredictable. 5 minutes before the president's address was announced, Meryl returned to the studio. She had spoken to her children, had some tea, and looked collected, although there were shadows of fatigue under her eyes. "Are you okay?" Anderson asked quietly when the cameras were turned off. "As much as possible," she replied. "You know, I've woken up every morning for the last 4 years feeling like I had to do something. That silence was complicity, and now that I've finally spoken out, I feel a strange sense of relief, despite all this chaos." "Live from the White House in 30 seconds, the director announced. The Oval Office appeared on screens across America. President Trump sat at the historic Resolute desk. Teleprompters were usually used for such addresses, but they were not visible. The president had a piece of paper in front of him, but he was not looking at it. His gaze was fixed on the camera, hard, determined, with barely concealed anger. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice suddenly controlled. "Today we witnessed what I have always called the greatest threat to our great nation, an elite disinformation campaign against a democratically elected president." In the CNN studio, Meryl leaned forward slightly, listening intently. Actress Meryl Streep, who as many of you know is a longtime supporter of the radical left, today made a series of false, defamatory, and, I would argue, potentially inflammatory statements about me and my administration. The president paused, tapping his fingers on the table. "Under normal circumstances, I would ignore such attacks. I have a country to run. But today I have decided to respond because this goes beyond the normal political debate. This is an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of a democratically elected government based on personal animosity and political bias." Trump picked up a glass of water from the table, took a sip and continued. "Ms. Streep called me, your president, a sociopath and a narcissist. She accused me of undermining democracy. These are serious charges that require a serious response." At that moment, the camera zoomed in on the president's face. His eyes seemed darker than usual. "I have instructed my administration to examine the forms of potential interference by outside influence groups in democratic processes, including the dissemination of knowingly false information that undermines confidence in the legitimately elected government." There was a collective gasp from the CNN studio. Anderson Cooper turned to Meryl, whose face had paled visibly. "In addition," the president continued, choosing his words carefully, "I believe it is high time that all citizens of our country were treated equally in matters of law enforcement and tax discipline. No one should receive special privileges because of his fame or connections in certain circles." Meryl sat motionless, her fingers gripping the armrests of the chair tighter. "Finally, I call on all patriotic Americans to boycott films and other projects featuring Meryl Streep. It's time to show these stuck-up celebrities that America is not their private playground for political games. America belongs to the people, and the people elected me president." Trump smiled slightly, but his eyes remained cold. "Fortunately, there are many talented actresses who love their country and respect its institutions. I am confident that cinema will only benefit without the participation of toxic personalities like Ms. Streep. With that, the White House broadcast ended, and the camera returned to the CNN studio, where Anderson Cooper turned to Meryl with a look of shock on his face. Meryl, I don't know what to say. This is unprecedented. The president just announced a targeted investigation of a citizen in response to her criticism. What is your response? Meryl straightened up slowly. She was pale, but her voice did not tremble. My answer is simple, Anderson. The president has just demonstrated to the entire country exactly what I've been talking about. Using federal agencies to persecute political opponents is a tactic of authoritarian regimes, not democracies. She paused, took a deep breath, and continued. I'm not afraid of investigations. My financial statements are in perfect order. I have committed no crimes. But the fact that the President of the United States publicly threatens a citizen with federal investigations for exercising her right to free speech? Her voice wavered with suppressed emotion. This confirms my fears more than anything I could say. Chapter 4. America chooses sides. Just 3 hours after the historic interview, America was already divided into two irreconcilable camps. The hashtags Meryl and Trump alternated among the top trends on Twitter. The White House phone lines were jammed with calls from those expressing support for the president and those expressing outrage at his actions. Meryl Streep left the CNN studios under heavy security through a back entrance. The crowd of journalists waiting for her at the main entrance were left empty-handed, but soon found Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaving the building for an interview on another program. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you think of the confrontation between Meryl Streep and the president? The reporters shouted as they surrounded her. AOC stopped, her eyes flashing. What we saw today is not just a dispute between a celebrity and a politician. This is a moment of truth for our democracy. The president is openly threatening to use federal law enforcement to prosecute a citizen for her political views. If that is not authoritarianism, what is? At the same time, in the Fox News studio, host Tucker Carlson was having a dialogue with Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, some critics say the president's actions today were excessive. What do you say? Cruz shook his head, his face expressing righteous indignation. You know, Tucker, I'm tired of the double standard. When Hollywood elites like Meryl Streep publicly insult the president, calling him a sociopath and a narcissist, it's considered free speech. But when the president responds, it suddenly becomes an attack on democracy. The left wants to be able to say whatever they want without consequences, but that's not how it works. Meanwhile, at the White House, President Trump called an emergency meeting with his chief of staff, advisors, and legal team. I want an investigation started immediately, he demanded, pacing the Oval Office. Dig deep. She must have skeletons in her closet. All these Hollywood hypocrites do. The legal advisor looked worried. Mr. President, with all due respect, there are some legal complications here. Initiating a federal investigation into a citizen solely based on criticism of you could be interpreted as an abuse of power. Trump stopped and turned to face the advisor, his face dark with anger. Who said it was just because of the criticism? I'm sure her tax returns are flawed. All those Hollywood types are. Find them. At this point, Meryl Streep reached her apartment on the Upper East Side. The phone kept ringing. Colleagues, friends, members of the media. She turned it off and sat by the window, looking out at the New York panorama, illuminated by the evening lights. Her husband, sculptor Don Gummer, sat next to her, holding her hand. You don't regret it? He asked quietly. Meryl turned to face him, tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear or regret. No, I would regret it if I kept quiet. For too long, too many of us have chosen comfort over truth. She picked up the phone from the table and turned it on. Immediately, a notification came about dozens of missed calls and hundreds of messages. I need to call the kids, she said. They need to know what's going on firsthand, not from the news. As she dialed her daughter's number, a new message appeared on the television screen. Breaking news. Hollywood celebrities announce massive rally of support for Meryl Streep. Chapter 5. Wave of Solidarity. By the following evening, with the story receiving widespread national media coverage, more than 70 prominent actors, directors, and other cultural figures had begun to express their support for Meryl Streep. By the end of the day, a joint statement had been released, signed by many prominent Hollywood figures, including George Clooney, Julia Roberts, Leonardo DiCaprio, Oprah Winfrey, and dozens of others. We stand with Meryl Streep to defend the right of every American to criticize government without fear of reprisal, the statement said. Using federal agencies to intimidate critics is a tactic used by dictators, not democratically elected leaders. We will not allow our America to become an authoritarian state. George Clooney, who was in Los Angeles, gave an interview to a local television station. You know, this isn't about politics anymore. This isn't about Republicans versus Democrats. This is about basic American values. The right to speak freely without fear that the president will publicly promise to sick the IRS on you. Clooney paused, choosing his words. Meryl did today what many of us should have done a long time ago. She spoke the truth, regardless of the consequences. And now we must all stand with her. Because if we allow the president to silence Meryl Streep, who will be next? At the same time in Washington, a group of 23 Democratic congressmen held an impromptu press conference on the steps of the Capitol. Today, we witnessed an unprecedented abuse of power, said Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The president publicly threatened to use federal law enforcement to prosecute a citizen for exercising her constitutional right to free speech. This is a violation of the president's oath to uphold the Constitution. She held up a copy of the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment exists precisely to protect political speech, especially criticism of government. If we allow the president to undermine this fundamental freedom, there will be nothing left of our democracy. Meanwhile, the president's supporters have also mobilized. One prominent conservative commentator after another has appeared on Fox News to defend Trump's actions. Meryl Streep has crossed the line, said Sean Hannity. She basically called the president of the United States mentally ill. That's not just disrespectful to the office. That's incitement. The hashtag Jury Boycott Meryl has been trending on social media, with supporters of the president posting videos of themselves burning DVDs of the actress's films and canceling subscriptions to streaming services that offer her films. By 9 p.m., the situation had become even more heated. A crowd spontaneously gathered in Times Square with signs reading, "I'm with Meryl and defend the First Amendment." Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, a group of Trump supporters staged a demonstration under the slogan, "Hollywood versus America." Meryl Streep remained in her apartment throughout the entire time, declining to comment. Her representative issued a brief statement. Ms. Streep appreciates the support, but will not be making any further comment at this time. She said all she had to say in today's interview. At 10 o'clock in the evening, CNN reported that the scandal had already reached an international level. The leaders of several democratic countries expressed concern about the threats of the U.S. president against the citizen who criticized him. This is unacceptable in a democratic society, said Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Freedom of speech and the freedom to criticize the government are fundamental rights that must be respected by all democratic leaders. French President Emmanuel Macron also issued a statement. France is following with concern the developments in the United States. The use of state apparatus to persecute government critics is contrary to the democratic principles that our countries share. At midnight, as much of the East Coast was getting ready for bed, President Trump's Twitter feed came alive. A series of posts appeared one after another. Hysterical Meryl and her Hollywood friends are trying to undermine the will of the American people. It won't work. MAGA. The IRS is doing its job. If Meryl is clean, she has nothing to fear. But is she? Strange coincidence. The same celebrities who support Meryl have been evading taxes for years through offshore companies. The Justice Department will check everything. CNN ratings are in free fall. People are seeing through their lies. Americans are with me. The tweets quickly went viral, further fueling the already heated atmosphere. TV channels rushed to call in experts to analyze the situation, although most acknowledged that the country had entered uncharted territory. We are witnessing a constitutional crisis in real time, Harvard constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe said on MSNBC's Breaking News. The president is openly threatening to use federal law enforcement to prosecute a citizen for exercising her right to free speech. That's not just a violation of the law, it's potentially a violation of the law. At 1 a.m., the security system in Meryl Streep's apartment went off. Someone threw a brick through a first-floor window. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but it was an alarming sign of an escalation of the conflict. The NYPD stepped up patrols in the area and set up a permanent post outside her home. Conflicting messages were leaking out of the White House at the time. Sources close to the administration reported a split among the president's advisors, with some pushing for de-escalation and others supporting a hard line. The president will not back down, CNN quoted an anonymous senior administration official as saying. He believes that Hollywood elites have interfered in politics with impunity for too long, and it's time to draw a line. By 2 a.m. on the East Coast, most Americans were asleep, but the news cycles continued to spin, dissecting every aspect of the unprecedented standoff. Social media was buzzing with commentary, memes, and conspiracy theories. In her Upper East Side apartment, Meryl Streep couldn't sleep. She sat on the couch, covered with a blanket, scrolling through messages of support from friends and colleagues. Her phone rang every few minutes with lawyers, publicists, and activists offering help and advice. Maybe we should get out of town for a few days, her husband suggested, until things calm down. Meryl shook her head. No, if I leave now, it will look like I was scared, like I did something wrong, and I didn't. I just told the truth. She put her phone down and looked out the window at New York City at night. You know, Don, I didn't expect it to go this far, but now that it has, I have no regrets. Maybe this is exactly what our country needed, a moment of truth. Chapter 6. The Dawn of a New Era. The dawn of a new day brought not calm but a new wave of tension. The morning papers came out with screaming headlines. President versus actress, constitutional crisis. New York Times. Trump declares war on Hollywood. Washington Post. Meryl Streep, heroine or traitor? USA Today. At 6 in the morning, when most Americans were just waking up, Meryl Streep's phone rang. An unfamiliar number with a Washington area code appeared on the screen. After some hesitation, she answered. Ms. Streep, this is Amanda Rogers, the president's deputy chief of staff. Meryl sat up straight, her heart beating faster. Yes, I'm listening to you. The president would like to meet with you, today, at the White House. There was a moment of silence as Meryl tried to process what she had heard. Meet me? After everything that happened yesterday? After he promised to sic the IRS and the Justice Department on me? The voice on the other end of the line remained professionally neutral. The president believes that direct dialogue will be useful for de-escalating the situation. The meeting will be private, without the press. Meryl took a deep breath, considering the offer. It could be a trap, or a genuine attempt to resolve the conflict, or a PR stunt to improve the president's image. I must consult my lawyers, she said finally. Of course, but the president would like an answer before 9 o'clock this morning. If you agree, we'll send a plane for you at 11. After the call ended, Meryl immediately contacted her attorney and then called an emergency meeting with her closest confidants via Zoom. Opinions were divided. It could be very dangerous, her longtime friend and director, Steven Spielberg, warned her. He controls the environment. He could lure you in and then humiliate you publicly. I agree, her publicist nodded. Besides, your mere appearance in the White House could be interpreted as a retreat, as if you were apologizing for your words. But Meryl's lawyer, David Sands, saw the situation differently. On the other hand, refusing to meet can be used against you. They will say that you are not interested in dialogue, that you just want to stir up conflict. Meryl listened to their arguments, tapping her fingers on the table. Finally, she raised her hand, stopping the discussion. I will go, not because I am afraid of his threats, and not because I am going back on my words, but because dialogue is the foundation of democracy. If the president is ready for dialogue, even after everything he has said and done, I must give it a chance. Her decision brought forth a new wave of arguments, but she remained adamant. At 8:55 in the morning, she called the White House and announced her acceptance. By 10 o'clock in the morning, news of the upcoming meeting had somehow leaked to the press. Television channels interrupted their regular broadcasts to carry breaking news bulletins. Political commentators theorized about what might lie behind the unexpected invitation. At 11:30, Meryl and her small team arrived at LaGuardia Airport, where they boarded a scheduled flight to Washington. She was dressed in a formal gray suit and was accompanied by her husband and 2 lawyers. Noticing the reporters in the terminal, she paused for a moment and made a brief statement. I accepted the invitation to the meeting at the White House. I hope for a constructive dialogue in the interests of our country, but I remain true to my position and my words. The plane landed in Washington at 1:15 p.m. They were met at the airport by a White House representative who escorted the group to an official car. On the way to the White House, Meryl noticed increased journalist activity and several news helicopters circling the sky. At 2 p.m., after going through all the standard security procedures and a preliminary meeting with administration staff, Meryl Streep was finally escorted into the West Wing of the White House. Her lawyers had to remain in the waiting room, Standard protocol for private meetings with the president. After about 20 minutes of waiting in the reception area, an aide escorted her to the Oval Office. The door opened, and she found herself face to face with President Trump. He stood at his desk, not moving toward her, not extending his hand in greeting. His face was inscrutable, his eyes cold and appraising. "Ms. Streep," he said finally, "thank you for accepting my invitation." Meryl nodded, maintaining her dignity. "Mr. President," he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. She sat with her back straight, her hands on her knees. "I've asked everyone to leave the room," Trump said as he sat down in his chair. "No aides, no recording devices, just you and me." She nodded again, waiting for him to get to the point. "Do you know why I invited you?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "I suppose you'll tell me that yourself, Mr. President." Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "Yesterday, you publicly insulted me. You called me a sociopath, a narcissist, a threat to democracy. You undermined trust in the institution of the presidency, and you set off a chain reaction that threatens the stability of our country." He paused, but Meryl remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Ms. Streep, public criticism is one thing, but what happened yesterday went beyond the usual political debate. Such unfounded accusations can have serious consequences. I am sure you understand that any public conflict of this magnitude will attract increased attention to all parties." His tone was measured, but the subtext was clear. Meryl felt a chill run down her spine, even though the president made no direct threat. "But I think there is a more constructive way forward," Trump continued, changing his tone to one of more conciliatory tone. "One that is good for everybody, including the country." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I propose that we hold a joint press conference, say tomorrow. You could say that after our meeting you have a more complete understanding of the situation, that although you may not agree with some of my policy decisions, you recognize that some of your formulations yesterday were overly emotional." Meryl felt her heart beat faster with indignation, but she kept a calm expression on her face. "And what will I get in return, Mr. President?" Trump smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "You will receive my public pardon. I will revoke the orders for investigations. I will even praise your patriotism and willingness to admit error. Your career and reputation will remain intact." He paused and then added, "Also, I'm thinking of creating a national arts program, a $2 billion budget. You could head it. Imagine the good you could do with those resources." Meryl looked at him, her face impassive, but her emotions raging inside. The offer was tempting, not for her sake, but for the sake of the artists, musicians, actors who really needed support. $2 billion could change the cultural landscape of America. "And if I choose to stick to my opinion?" she asked quietly. Trump slowly leaned back in his chair, his face becoming more tense. "Then I'm afraid this situation will continue to escalate. And, Mrs. Streep, when public conflicts of this level continue, it usually doesn't end well for either party. The public eye becomes extremely intense on every aspect of your life, on your projects, on the activities of your loved ones." He paused, giving her a chance to process the subtext. "You know, I heard that your daughter is developing an interesting creative project in Brooklyn. An art school, if I'm not mistaken. In the current economic situation, such initiatives face many bureaucratic obstacles. Permits, licenses, grants. So many details that can go wrong, even with the best intentions of all parties involved." Meryl felt the rage rise in her like a hot wave. Threatening her was one thing, but threatening her children? "Mr. President, I think we're starting to get into an area that I'm very concerned about," she said, trying to remain calm, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm simply describing the reality of political life in Washington, Ms. Streep. In public conflicts of this magnitude, there are always unintended consequences. For all parties." They looked at each other across the table, the actress and the president, two men who had each reached the top of their field, each accustomed to winning. "You have 1 hour to think about it," Trump finally said. "At 3 o'clock, we will either go to the press together and announce a reconciliation, or I will go alone and announce a full-scale investigation of you and all individuals and entities associated with you." He stood up, making it clear that the conversation was over. "My assistant will take you to a restroom where you can think about your decision. Everything you need is there, including a telephone if you want to consult with someone." When Meryl left the Oval Office, she was greeted by a young woman with a tight smile and led into a small but comfortable room. There was a couch, a table with fruit and drinks, and a telephone. Alone, Meryl sank down on the couch and closed her eyes. A million thoughts raced through her head. What would Katharine Graham, the courageous publisher of the Washington Post who stood up to Nixon, do? What would Eleanor Roosevelt do? What would her own mother, who had always taught her to stand up for what was right, do? She picked up the phone and dialed her husband's number. After briefly describing the situation, she asked his opinion. "He's got you cornered, honey," Don said after a long pause. "It's a classic scare tactic. But ultimately, the decision has to be yours. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." She then called her lawyer, who was shocked by what he heard. "This is pure blackmail, Meryl. It's illegal. We can file a complaint with—" "Which court?" Meryl interrupted. "The Supreme Court, where he appointed 3 justices? The Justice Department, which he controls?" The lawyer fell silent, acknowledging the truth of her words. "Then perhaps it's worth agreeing for the sake of appearances. And then, when you're safe, and become like him? A man whose word is worth nothing?" The next call was to her daughter. As she told her of the hidden threat, Meryl felt her voice shake with anger. "Mom, don't agree," Mamie said firmly. "I'll close the school if I have to. I'll get another job. I'll move to another country. But don't let him break you." The last call was to her longtime friend, the great director Martin Scorsese. "Martin, what would you do in my place?" she asked. Scorsese was silent for a moment, considering the situation. "You know, Meryl, I've made a lot of movies about gangsters, about people who bully others to get what they want. And one thing I've learned over the years is that if you give in to a blackmailer once, he'll never leave you alone. Ever." At 2:50, the door of the room opened and the same assistant entered. "Mr. President awaits your decision, Ms. Streep." Meryl stood up, straightened her jacket, and nodded. "I'm ready." When she returned to the Oval Office, Trump was standing at the window, looking out onto the White House lawn. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "So, Ms. Streep, what is your decision?" Meryl looked at him with her back straight and her head held high. "I refuse, Mr. President." Trump's face darkened, but she continued, not letting him interrupt. "I will not go back on my words because they were true, and I will not trade my principles for security or privilege." She took a step forward, her voice growing stronger. "You can start your investigations. You can sic the IRS on me. You can even try to harm my family. But you know what you can't do, Mr. President? You can't make me afraid of you." Trump looked at her, his face contorted with anger. "You are making a huge mistake. A huge one. I will destroy you." Meryl shook her head. "No, you won't. Because today, as I leave this building, I will tell the press about our conversation, about your threats, about your offer, about how you threatened my daughter." She took another step forward. "And you know what will happen then, Mr. President? The American people will see you for who you really are. Not a strong leader, but a frightened tyrant who can't stand criticism from a woman." Trump opened his mouth to respond, but she interrupted him. "I'm leaving, and I'm going to tell the truth. Today, tomorrow, and every day you hold this office. Because that's what patriotism is. Not blind loyalty to the president, but loyalty to the ideals and values on which this country was built." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "If you walk out that door and tell anyone about our conversation, you'll regret it, Meryl. I promise you." She turned around one last time, and a slight, almost pitying smile appeared on her face. "You know what the saddest thing is, Mr. President? What you don't understand is that the fear you inspire may give you power, but it will never give you respect. And without respect, power is just tyranny." With these words, she walked out of the Oval Office, leaving the President of the United States alone with his anger and fear. Meryl Streep was immediately surrounded by journalists upon leaving the White House. Dozens of TV channels broadcast her appearance live to the world. Her face was calm but determined. Her eyes shone with unwavering confidence. "Miss Streep, what happened at the meeting with the president?" the journalist shouted. She raised her hand for silence, and when the crowd had calmed down a little, she spoke in a clear, strong voice. "I met with President Trump today at his invitation. I was hoping for a constructive dialogue about the future of our country and the concerns I expressed yesterday. Instead, I was met with threats, blackmail, and an attempt to force me to recant." A murmur ran through the crowd and the cameras moved closer. "The president offered me a deal. I would publicly recant my criticism, and he would drop his threats of investigations and even offer me the chance to head a new $2 billion national arts program." Now the journalists held their breath, realizing that they were witnessing a historic moment. When I refused, he threatened not only me, but my family as well. In particular, he hinted that he could create problems for my daughter's business. There was a real buzz among the journalists, everyone trying to ask questions at the same time. Meryl raised her hand again. I stand here today not as an actress or as a Democrat or a Republican. I stand here as an American who loves her country and believes in its fundamental values: freedom, justice, and truth. Her voice became stronger and filled with passion. The president thinks he can intimidate me, as he has intimidated so many others. But intimidation only works when we allow fear to rule us. Today I say to the president and to all Americans, I am not afraid. We must not be afraid. At that moment, the doors of the White House opened again, and President Trump walked out onto the steps, flanked by several aides. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed as he saw Meryl still speaking to the press. Journalists immediately turned their cameras to capture both participants in the drama. This is an irresponsible distortion of the facts, Trump said, his voice tense but controlled. Our meeting was conducted in a spirit of conciliation, and I offered a constructive way to de-escalate the situation. Meryl turned towards him, maintaining her dignity. Mr. President, I have described the content of our conversation as I understood it, and I think the American people are capable of drawing their own conclusions. The American people are tired of certain elites trying to manipulate public opinion, Trump responded, his voice rising. People are seeing these endless attacks on the duly elected president. Meryl shook her head slightly, looking regretful. I love this country deeply, Mr. President. That's why I feel it's my duty to stand up for the values that make America great. Trump stepped forward, his face visibly red. You will regret your choice, Ms. Streep. When certain facts become public knowledge, when the investigations begin, you have no idea what you are up against. At this point, all the cameras were trained on the president, capturing his every word. His closest advisors looked worried. One of them tried to gently steer the president back to the door. You forget who exactly makes policy in this country, who appoints the judges, who runs the executive branch, not some Hollywood critics out of touch with reality. Meryl stood quietly, letting his words speak for themselves. Millions of Americans watching the standoff live heard their president openly threaten to use federal law enforcement to prosecute a citizen for criticizing her. Finally, the advisors managed to lead Trump back to the White House. The door closed behind him, but the echo of his words remained in the air. Meryl turned to the reporters, her face pale but determined. What you just saw was not a conflict between an actress and a president. It was a clash between authoritarianism and democracy, between intimidation and free speech, between lies and truth. She paused, looking around at the cameras and reporters. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know what consequences await me. But I know one thing. At such moments, silence is complicity, and I will not remain silent anymore. With that, she headed towards the waiting car, leaving behind shocked journalists and a nation in a state of shock. Over the next hour, every major television network showed and reshown footage of the standoff outside the White House. Political pundits, constitutional lawyers, and former administration officials from both parties tried to make sense of the president's unprecedented public admission that he intended to use federal law enforcement to persecute critics. CNN put a Harvard University constitutional law professor on air. What we saw today goes far beyond a political conflict. The president openly admitted that he intends to use his power to prosecute a citizen for exercising her right to free speech. This is not just a violation of the norm. It is a violation of the law and the constitutional oath of the president. Fox News, which usually supports the president, was at a loss. Some commentators tried to defend Trump, talking about the deep state and Hollywood elites. But even they seemed unsure in the face of the president's clear threats. The debate has begun in Congress. Several Democratic lawmakers have announced plans to convene special oversight committee hearings to examine possible abuses of executive power. Notably, several moderate Republicans have also expressed grave concern about the situation and called for a thorough examination of the circumstances. Senator Mitt Romney issued a statement. What I saw today deeply disturbs me as a Republican, as a conservative, and as an American. Using federal agencies to persecute political opponents is a tactic of authoritarian regimes, not democracies. It is time for all of us to remember our oath to the Constitution, not to man. The international reaction was even harsher. Leaders of democratic countries expressed shock and condemnation. The German chancellor called Trump's actions unacceptable in a democratic society. The French president spoke of dark times for Western democracy. On social media, the hashtag #Meryl became the absolute leader, followed by impeachment now. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary Americans posted messages of support. Some posted videos in which they read the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech. Meryl Streep returned to her New York apartment in the evening. She was physically and emotionally exhausted, but calm. A supportive crowd had gathered outside her building. Ordinary New Yorkers holding homemade signs that read, "Thank you for being brave," and "Truth over fear." She waved and disappeared into the building. Back at her apartment, she hugged her husband, called her children, and finally allowed herself a few tears. Not of fear, not of regret, but of relief that she had finally told the truth she had kept to herself for too long. The White House was in chaos. The president's advisors were trying to devise a damage control strategy, but Trump refused to listen to their calls for de-escalation. Instead, he locked himself in his living quarters with his phone, firing off one angry tweet after another. "Meryl Streep is lying. Never threatened her or her family. She was the one trying to blackmail me. Democrats and Hollywood elites are trying to stage a coup d'etat. It won't work. The IRS needs to audit all these celebrities who haven't paid their fair share for years. Let's start with lying Meryl." Each new tweet only made matters worse, confirming Meryl's accusations. By midnight, it was clear that the country was in the midst of a constitutional crisis. Television networks continued their 24-hour coverage, and experts discussed possible scenarios, from impeachment to invoking the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which allows the removal of a president who is unable to carry out his duties. In her apartment, Meryl watched the news with the sound turned off. She felt a strange calm, as if she had walked through fire and was finally freed from the burden of silence. Her phone rang. It was a Washington number, but not the one that had rung that morning. She answered it with some caution. "Mrs. Streep, this is Janet Montgomery, senior advisor to Speaker Pelosi." Meryl sat up straight, surprised by the call from the House Speaker's office. "Good evening. How can I help you?" "Speaker Pelosi has instructed me to reach out to you. The events of today have caused grave concern to many members of the legislature. What you did today took extraordinary courage, and your words have caused many to reflect on the current state of our democratic institutions." The advisor's voice was professionally restrained, but there was genuine concern in it. In the coming days, the House Judiciary Committee plans to begin preliminary consultations on the issue of potential abuse of executive power. Once the process is formally launched, the committee will likely want to invite you to testify about your conversation with the president. Meryl closed her eyes. It was one thing to confront the president in the media, but quite another to testify on the record before Congress. "It will be difficult, Madam Speaker, but if you think it will help protect our democracy, I will do it. I know this is asking for even more sacrifice on your part, Meryl, but sometimes history is not written by those in high places, but by those who have the courage to stand up and say, 'This is wrong.'" After the conversation ended, Meryl sat for a long time, looking out the window at the New York night. Tomorrow she would face a new challenge, perhaps the most difficult in her life. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was doing the right thing. Not as an actress, not as a celebrity, but as a citizen of the country she loved with all her heart. At that moment, her phone rang again. This time it was former FBI Director James Comey, who was fired by Trump several years ago. "Ms. Streep, I've been watching this today, and I want to tell you one important thing. Do not be afraid. Many of us who took an oath to defend the Constitution, not man, are ready to stand with you." He paused and then added, "History will remember those who spoke truth in the face of power. And I suspect it will remember you not only as a great actress, but as a patriot in the truest sense of the word." Meryl smiled, feeling a surge of strength and determination. Tomorrow would be another day, another battle. But truth was on her side, and in the long run, as she always believed, truth always wins. She didn't know what awaited her at the congressional hearings tomorrow. She didn't know how far the president would go in his revenge. She didn't know whether the American people would support her or turn their backs. But she knew one thing: the silence was over, and there was no turning back.